Hey everybody, Mary Fran Bontempo here. And before we get started with today's show, I just wanted to let you know that my new book, From Broken to Brilliant, How to Live a Brilliantly Resilient Life, is available on Amazon. Super excited about this book, which provides a roadmap of how to live a brilliantly resilient life. You'll get advice not only from me, but from so many dozens of our podcast guests who were kind enough to share their tips on how to reset, rise, and reveal your own brilliance. So head on over to Amazon, get a copy of the book From Broken to Brilliant, and now let's get on with the show. Welcome to the Brilliantly Resilient podcast. What's your train wreck? Everyone has one. The question is, are you just visiting or are you going to live there? I'm Mary Fran Bontempo. Join me and let's learn how to come through those train wrecks, not broken, but brilliant. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Brilliantly Resilient podcast. I am your host, Mary Fran Bontempo, and I have with me today a very inspiring and interesting woman. Her name is Shawnta Hooks. Shawnta is a keynote speaker and workplace belonging strategist. Don't we all want to belong, especially at the workplace where it can seem really hard? So, Shawnta, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
So, one of the reasons, there were so many reasons that I wanted to talk to you, but a lot of what you talk about is belonging and connection in the workplace. And I mean, it's a really interesting concept because I think most people in the workplace feel that they have a space, a place there. And I'm not sure everybody is comfortable branching away from that space, but it almost requires that because belonging requires connection. And you can't do that if you stay in your own little box. So, what I'd like to start with is you telling me what that means to you. What is that workplace connection? Give me a general definition.
Sure. Yeah. I like to start. I love definitions because I think as adults, we often lose sight of what words really mean. And for me, belonging is really when you, as an individual, feel seen, connected, heard, and supported in your environment. Right. And that is, it's a two-way street, right? It's not just the organization's responsibility to create an environment where people feel seen, heard, connected, supported. And it's not just the employee's responsibility to show up and to feel seen and to feel connected, so on and so forth. Oftentimes, organizations talk about belonging from the organization's perspective, right? And sometimes it's even narrowly connected to pizza parties and ways that we can make our employees happy and engagement, which are all really important, especially depending on the culture of the organization. But from my perspective, and I draw on my own personal experiences, and it kind of goes into why I even started doing this work of helping organizations understand the connection between workplace belonging and mindfulness and meditation. The reason I started doing this work is because I was at one point in my career, a 20-year career working in corporate compliance, accounting, as well as regulatory compliance. And in one of the roles, I was working in a really toxic work environment. And I absolutely felt invisible. I felt excluded. I felt a complete lack of support. And in that experience, I really wanted to blame the environment. And a lot of it did fall on the environment. I mean, just intellectually, the job was the result of a restructure and a reorg. There were people that were laid off. There were departments merged together. People weren't really happy, right, with their new role. We were storming and, not even norming. We were storming, trying to figure out how to work together. And I just so happened to be a casualty in that experience. And so initially it felt really comfortable to blame the environment. But this was the catalyst for me to start to create practices for myself centered in mindfulness and meditation. And after about 6 months of really going deep into my own transformation, I'm happy to share more about that journey. After about 6 months, my perspective started to shift. I really started to just see the bigger picture. I started to see where I was shutting down, where I was shutting myself out of opportunities to actually make connections with my coworkers and my stakeholders. I saw where I fit into this problem of belonging. And some of that had absolutely nothing to do with the workplace, but it had to do with things going on in my personal life. I was still mourning the loss of my dad. I was a new mother. Like there were just all these different things that were happening that were pulling my attention away from the present moment, pushing me into just a complete feeling of disconnection. And so mindfulness was the tool that really helped me see that, right? See it for what it was, become less judgmental. And literally, it's a really cool story because literally things turned around. I started to improve in my job. I started to make connections. I started to solve problems that were completely unsolvable because I was so much more focused and connected to my environment. And I didn't show up fake and phony. Like if there were people that I just didn't really vibe with, I allowed that relationship to be what it was, but I absolutely strengthened myself, my sense of owning my mantra, which is I belong where I am.
Hmm. Oh, I really love that. I belong where I am. So I don't even know where to start because there's so many things that you just said that I really want to touch on. But let's start because this is the centerpiece of your practice. Let's start with this piece of mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that I want to start there is because words like mindfulness, authenticity, all those things have become the lingo of the moment. The
Mm-hmm.
problem with that can sometimes be that people just get deaf to it. It's okay, we're being mindful, we're being authentic. So, and especially I think in a corporate environment where words like that, I call them the woo woo words, where people think, oh, yes, we're going to be mindful, we're going to be authentic. So, how do you take something like that that often seems like because it's tied to an emotional part of us, which is something we're supposed to leave at home when we're at work? How do you take words like that there's almost a pushback against and make them palpable and strategic in a corporate environment?
Yeah, honestly, it for me, the way that I have been successful because my business platform is predominantly organizational and in corporate spaces. I think the reason I've been successful at communicating and I was very intentional about using the language of mindfulness, meditation, authenticity, words that you said can sometimes feel woo-woo. I've heard that phrase before, feel fringe, feel unnecessary, feel
Mm-hmm.
less
Yes.
important, right? Um, when I'll start with, sort of the story, because it's the story that creates the connections. For me, my story is that I was not a believer of meditation. I am an accountant by trade, a CPA. I started my career in public accounting over 20 years ago.
And you
And
are the
I was
antithesis of what
the
everybody thinks
complete
should be in
opposite.
that
Yeah,
space.
yeah, like the complete opposite. I'm from Detroit, Michigan, a blue collar city. Mindfulness was not in my environment, although it was in my home. My father, may he rest in peace, my father was a meditator. He picked up meditation through his martial arts practices.
Oh.
But I grew up at a time where that was his practice. It wasn't something he talked about. It wasn't something he taught me. It was just something that I observed him do. And even though I watched him do it, I still didn't intellectually understand it. And because I didn't understand it, I didn't make it a lifestyle habit until life got complicated. And it was literally right before COVID. It's really interesting timing because I started to really develop my lifestyle habits around mindfulness about 7 months before COVID. And the thing that got me was really practical language, right? And now I do see it as, spiritual and emotional, and I see it, from a full circle perspective. But initially, I need to just understand it intellectually, right? Understand what it is, which is I define mindfulness as paying attention to the present moment on purpose without judgment. 4 parts, right? Paying attention to the present moment on purpose without judgment. When you think of that definition that way, now you can sort of synthesize how that fits into the workplace, right? As someone that has managed teams before, I've managed teams as large as 19 globally. And if you could imagine managing 19 people that work across the world, right, and trying to get them to focus, get them to be engaged, get them to be in the present moment, get them to be non-judgmental, right, about the work that they're doing, about the problems that are going on in the department. That is those are leadership capabilities, right, to be able to invoke that in your teams. And so for me, it was understanding what it is. And now that I understand what it is, I see how it directly applies to what we do at work. and understanding how when organizations, and there's so much data to support this, but I love the case studies, again, the stories. I started to learn about how organizations, market leaders like Salesforce had, and again, pre-COVID, now it's kind of a pop culture moment, but pre-COVID, I was reading articles about how Salesforce and the CEO had invested in calm zones in their offices because the CEO was very much aware of the impact that moments of calm can have on your productivity, on your focus, on your ability to operate at peak performance. Google, Amazon, hedge funds, Ray Dalio, who had one of the largest hedge funds in the world, staunch supporter of mindfulness and meditation and bringing into organizational culture. And so what I say to organizations that may still be struggling with the language, and I think that's actually less now because, honestly, because of COVID, right? When COVID happened, the explosion of mindfulness being in our face and not being taboo, being seen as a real tool, a tool that we can bring into every part of our life, including our work lives, to, again, recenter and focus us during a time of just peak distraction. Peak emotional dysregulation. So I don't really face too much pushback. I do have to sometimes help organizations understand the value. And the value, from a very practical perspective, is that, when employees feel more connected to their environments, they produce greater results. And one way that you can get employees to feel connected to their environment is to help them learn how to be connected to the present moment, because the present moment is your environment, right? So many times we spend our thoughts trying to get out of where we are right now. I don't want to be at work.
Yeah.
Everywhere but here, right? And so developing practices, really grounded practices, whether you see them as spiritual, mental, physical, emotional, they literally cross all four of those spectrums. But developing habits and practices that bring you out of your thinking mind, out of your overthinking, over analytical, negative thinking mind, and into the present moment is extremely beneficial in terms of driving performance, driving profits, reducing retention, and improving the overall employee morale.
It's really funny because as you're talking, I'm thinking to myself, well, mindfulness can just be another word for focus, which is a big thing, obviously, in the corporate environment. It's also this piece of being without judgment. And I think that that's really key because, in order to proceed really in any kind of environment, we really have to look at what the facts are and what the truth is. And as emotional creatures, that's a hard thing to do, especially in our personal lives, obviously. But I think that that's very simple idea of mindfulness or focusing on just the present moment without judging it. What am I looking at right here? What are the facts of what we're looking at? And how can we make that situation better, move it forward, whatever, and focusing on purpose. Okay, right now, this is what we're going to look at. And I think it's really hard. I mean, because obviously we live in a world where we're constantly being assaulted by information.
Right.
So the concept of focusing, first of all, on the work. So that I think is kind of what we just talked about. But now let's move that over and talk about being mindful about this connectivity, these connections. And when I talk about being brilliantly resilient, it's with the attitude that everyone has their area of brilliance, everyone has their space, everyone has their piece to contribute. But if we don't find out enough about each other and make those connections, we often don't know what that is in another person. And then the talent goes to waste. So let's talk about that piece of it.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. I've attended recently a few sales classes, nothing to do with mindfulness and meditation. But I was able to sit in on these courses and, listening to the language that learning and development organizations teach sales professionals, right? What they teach them is how to pay attention to their clients, how to get information, how to listen attentively to their clients so that they can gain insight and information that will help them understand the value that they, as a sales professional, can bring to their client or to their stakeholder, right? In order for you to be able to do that, you have to be paying attention. your mind, or another way to say this is you have a higher probability of being successful at that task, of paying attention to the person you're talking to and gaining, actionable and valuable insight to be able to help them, which helps you. In order to do that, you have to be present, right? And I think, my theory is that humanity has really just sort of gotten out of practice with being present. And it makes sense, right? Like we could talk all day about all the reasons, right? So, going back to the Industrial Revolution, right? And we can go a lot of different ways with that conversation. But the truth is, we're just not that good at it right now. And so, what do we do when we're not good at something? We have to practice. And that's what I see mindfulness is, meditation specifically is a practice. Meditation is the practice of being in the present moment on purpose without judgment. Mindfulness is the result, right? It's the state of mind where you are doing that. And so, you can use the words interchangeably. And I don't get too caught up on the language there. But, I personally, and I could have called it anything. I could have called it focus. There are some people that call this work mindset training. There are some people that call this work, they call it all different types of things. I wanted to be true to what my experience was. I didn't learn how to be present from, quote unquote, mindset coaching. I learned it through practicing meditation by sitting down, closing my eyes, shutting out my outside environment, and picking one thing to focus on, right? Picking whether it is my breath, whether it is a sound, whether it is even sometimes you can have unfocused meditation where you just let your thoughts roam, right? And you just observe where your thoughts are. That's actually a very powerful tool for brainstorming, right? And I like using the language of meditation because I think for most people, when they think of meditation, they imagine someone sitting with their eyes closed. And that's actually a very important part of this because, again, most of us are really out of practice with being still. As a matter of fact, the great philosopher Pascal once said that humanity would solve, and I'm paraphrasing here, but humanity would solve so many of its problems if we would learn to sit in a quiet room by ourselves, right? And so the act of meditation is sitting still in a quiet space, typically with your eyes closed or with them, low at a soft gaze. The eyes closed, though, because you're shutting out one of your senses. And that's really important to do because, again, the problem that we're facing is distraction. So when you start to train yourself to be comfortable with less stimulation in a contained environment like meditation, then you start to reap those benefits in your real life to where you're not necessarily on a pillow, right? Or in your meditation section, you're doing your work and the pings from the emails are popping up and the phone and all these distractions are coming. But because you've been practicing and conditioning your mind to be in the present moment, to be focused, to be aware, then you have a higher probability of being able to reduce those distractions, cut them off, and really just navigate back to your purpose, which may just be your work. It may be talking to your children, right? Or a loved one, just being focused on the thing that matters to you most as opposed to all the distractions.
I really like that idea of being focused on the thing that matters to you most. And to your point, I mean, silence is so rare in this world. I mean, it's just so rare because it's funny. I mean, I will sit at my kitchen table at some point and I'll think, okay, I'm just going to sit here by myself. It'll be nice. And then all of a sudden somebody's mowing the lawn. So it's,
Yep.
it's, it's,
Mhm.
it's pretty much an assault on your senses all of the time. But this idea of, first of all, accepting that it's okay, because I feel like there's almost the sense of, well, if I'm not engaged, then I'm not doing anything.
Yeah.
And I think the problem with that becomes, well, if you're not engaged in focusing on something, you can't possibly do anything because there's
Right.
just too much going on.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And the reality is the distractions are here,
Mhm.
right? They're
They're
here.
not going anywhere. Yeah.
You turn one notification off, another one pops up. they're like weeds in the lawn, right?
Yeah. Oh,
They
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
continue to creep. And I live in a very noisy environment. I live across the street from a cement factory. Next door to the cement factory is a high school football field.
Oh, my
Like
gosh.
literally, I'm pointing. If I point right here, there's the cement factory, and then next to the cement factory is the high school football field where there's marching band practice, football games, and it's open to the public. So there's soccer games at night, right?
Oh, my
And
gosh.
so I am so thankful that I found these practices because now I can tune the noise out. Every now and then it annoys me, right? But I accept the annoyance. I remember early in my learnings about meditation, I read this book called Mindfulness in Plain English. Highly recommend it to anyone listening to this podcast, Mindfulness in Plain English. And the author uses this analogy of why we should meditate, why we should practice mindfulness. He uses this story of being at home and at night, you're laying in bed trying to rest, and all of a sudden you hear a dog barking. And the dog is just barking over and over. It's getting louder and louder. And the louder the dog gets, the more frustrated you get. And as you get frustrated, your thoughts get more negative to the point where they may cycle into, I want to, go find that neighbor who owns that dog and I want to say nasty things to them. Maybe I want to call the cops. Maybe I want to do something harmful to the dog. That's one reaction. Another reaction is to simply just observe the sound, right? To observe the sound with neutrality. Not that it's a good sound or a bad sound, it's a sound. Get curious about the sound. And eventually and this is a practice, I practice this, especially living in this loud environment. I do this all the time. When I find myself getting frustrated with the distraction, I take a moment and make that distraction my practice. I lean into it and I notice how my thoughts go from negative to neutral. And a lot of times that's what we're trying to do in life. We're trying to navigate from feeling these negative, strong, unpleasant emotions to just getting to a place of neutrality. And if we get to positivity, wonderful, right? But sometimes what we need is just neutrality, get to our center, right? I think that's why they call it your center. It's that place of it's not good, it's not bad, it just is. Imagine it's just anyone listening to this, imagine the impact that could have on workplace conflict. Imagine the impact of being able to go from negative, frustrated, annoyed, disconnected to neutral, the impact that could have on employee relations, the impact that could have on results because people don't get stuck and stay stuck as long. I think we're really just on the brink of really understanding how powerful and impactful this can be for the human experience, but specifically the human experience at work.
All of that, again, I'm listening to you and I'm sort of envisioning these corporate environments where, everybody comes well equipped with their own stressors and with the things that kind of set them off. And there's obviously, I don't want to say a lack of understanding, but simply a lack of awareness when you're in your zone and you're stressed about something and somebody else is in their zone and they're stressed about something. And this idea of, okay, let's see if we can meet on a neutral place. And that's not always easy, but this whole concept of, first of all, of being without judgment, talk about needing that in the world these days, let alone in a corporate environment. When you can just, again, put aside the emotion, and that's a really difficult thing to do. But I think just the simple awareness that, just as you said, these sounds trigger an emotion.
Mm-hmm.
If you recognize the connection, once again, there's that word, the connection between, okay, this sound is triggering a negative emotion in me, which is making me want to act in a negative way. So it all really does go back to that word connection and maybe recognizing what our connections are to these individual things. So then the next question becomes, once we recognize our connections to these things and maybe get to that place of neutrality, how do we make a connection with another coworker? How do we take that to that next step?
I love this question. And I have a process background, so I think of things in process, right? You may see
Which
me,
is really helpful in a corporate
it's
space.
very helpful because really our lives are a series of processes. The way we think is a series of processes. And I always say between a thought and an action is a pause. And when we honor that pause, meaning we allow it, we hold space for the pause, we get into that space of neutrality. Once we're in that space of neutrality, now we can choose whether or not we want to be in a space of empathy, right? Empathy where we really feel and step into a space of understanding another, right? I think about DEI, right? Think about, when we talk about DEI-B, and the attack on DEI, right? And this idea that DEI creates, for some people, it creates connection. For others, it feels like disconnection. The reality is that we are all navigating. We're all navigating in and out of feeling connected and disconnected. But what helps is to understand the other's perspective. to really see it outside of your perspective, see it in a new, again, seeing it from a neutral perspective. When you're able to do that, suddenly things become, you have a different perspective, right? You have a different perspective on what is happening in the environment. And so I think as a staunch supporter of DEI programs, I place my brand in the hands of belonging because it is such an important part to this conversation about equity and inclusion and diversity. In order for you to understand the value of equity, diversity, inclusion, you have to be able to be empathetic to another. You have to be able to understand their position. And in order to understand those that are perhaps against programs that are centered in equity, inclusion, belonging, diversity, you have to understand their perspective. That doesn't mean you have to agree, right? It does not mean that you have to agree, but it certainly helps to understand, because now you can problem solve from a place of understanding, right? And that understanding is not just mental. It's not just logical. It's both mental and emotional, right? That's true empathy, is understanding from both a logical and an emotional space, from a head space and a heart space. When you can tap into that, and again, mindfulness is a tool, right? Now we're talking about the goal for most organizations. I don't think you could talk to many leaders and ask them, do you want your employees to be more empathetic? Most will say yes, right? So the question is, how do I get there, right? How do I get my employees to be more empathetic, to be more understanding, to be more connected, to be less judgmental, to be less afraid? Because our judgment is really just a reflection of our fear. It's a reflection that in order for them to win, I have to lose. And that's a perspective, right? That is a perspective. I hold no judgment against that perspective. But in order for you to, I can objectively say that that's a fear-based perspective. And so organizationally, it behooves us to try to help our employees navigate out of states of fear, because that's where we get blocked. That's where we have disconnection, conflict, and all the things that we don't want that actually do drive down profits. In order for us to get there, we have to have tools. And one of the oldest tools that has literally been around, it's discussed in every spiritual philosophy, it's discussed in psychology, it's discussed from an intellectual program. You have mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, which is a very clinical way of teaching mindfulness and meditation. You can pick your language, you can pick your lane, but one of the most successful and influential tools that you can have to help yourself and your teams and your employees and the people that you care about navigate out of states of distrust and fear and disconnection and stuckness is mindfulness and meditation. How to go from that space of disconnection to neutrality, to understanding how you can perceive with a combination of head and heart. Now I have empathy. Now I can get to understanding. Now I can have better harmony in my space.
It's funny. Everything that you're saying is triggering things in my mind that I have said using different language. Yeah. And I think that that's part of this. It's finding that that not neutral necessarily, but that commonality of language, or that at least an awareness that we're saying the same things. We may just be using different words. Yep. And I think that that's common with most people. But one of the things that I come back to when I urge people to really look at their situations and their perception is to ask a very simple question. Is it true? Mm-hmm. Because our truth and someone else's truth may be different. But by simply saying those three words, is it true? And by true meaning factual, unequivocally, there's nothing that you can say that would dispute it. I think most of us would find that somewhere in there's wiggle room, because our facts are, again, as we went back to in our earlier part of the conversation, it's all colored by emotion. In order to get to that place of neutrality, you have to recognize that. What's the fact? How do I put my emotion about this somewhere else? And at least recognize that other people have just as legitimate a case to be made for their emotional reactions to this. How do we all move this aside and then move forward? And I think, to your point, once we do that, we are so much more able to make connections. We are so much more able to build teams when we recognize, I think the goals are probably pretty much the same for most of us. It's just what we bring to the table because of our other personal experiences. I could talk to you all day. I really could, because this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. And you did a great job of taking those words that a lot of people who don't think of mindfulness and meditation as something that has a practical benefit for them in just their everyday lives. I think you did a really great job. Thank you for that, of making that accessible.
Yeah, yeah. And I know we're probably going to close out soon, but I just want to emphasize what you said. Is it true? Because something that I often tell my students is to ask themselves that question about their thoughts,
Yes.
right? Just because you think a thought does not mean that you have to believe it, right? Thoughts are just thoughts. And when we start to, really again pause, my mantra is honor the pause, and that is the name of many of my programs. When we start to honor that pause and do different practices, I mean, there are a variety of practices. Asking yourself questions is one of them. When you do that, then you come out on the other side of that with a different perspective, right? And the other thing I just want to really quickly touch on is the role of emotions, because I want to emphasize that this isn't about stopping your emotions, ignoring your emotions, or shoving your emotions into a box never to be looked at again. This is about honoring your emotion in that pause, making space for that emotion, giving yourself permission to feel. Doesn't mean that you have to be, crying in the middle of a meeting or be emotionally dysregulated. But we have to understand, and it's a bigger conversation, but understand that emotions are clues. They're clues that when we start to, honor them, that's how you make connection. For example, if you're with a team member and you find yourself being emotional in a conversation, maybe they're giving you feedback and you find yourself being emotional, your initial reaction, your fear-based reaction could possibly be to just shove that emotion down, pretend like everything's okay, and to continue to have the conversation as if I'm not fazed, bothered by this feedback that I'm receiving. But you're missing an opportunity to connect with that person. Because if you do acknowledge that I'm feeling something here, and you were to actually say that to the person, I'm feeling something about this, and whatever that is, now actually may have a moment where they can step into empathy and understand you. Maybe they felt that before too. And now we're having a dialogue about how we feel, what we feel at work. And now we have a dialogue that can lead to a connection, that can lead to someone being your ally, sponsor, or mentor. Right. I just want to, show people how this really plays out in real situations. It's being authentic, allowing emotion to be present when it's necessary, especially when it can be a driver of connection, and then constantly allowing yourself to navigate from experiences that are unpleasant to neutrality. And then after neutrality, you go where you need to go. But you do that from a space of neutrality first.
I love all of that. And it actually brought up another thought, because all of this has to start, from what I'm hearing from you, is connection with yourself.
That's it. That's it. That's it. That's why I believe I bring a different perspective to this conversation, because, and I love the work that organizations are doing with investing in employees, investing in their mental health, investing in environments that are supportive, that allow employees to feel seen through diversity groups and affinity groups, ERGs. I love it. I love it. I love it. And in addition to that, in order for that to really maximize the results, right? In order for, I can speak in those terms, right? If you are a chief HR officer and you're investing in, billions of dollars in employee engagement and experience, but not teaching employees how to connect with self, then you have a higher probability of some of those programs lacking engagement and success. But when you combine the two, when you teach employees how to really connect to themselves, connect to their heart, connect to their mind, connect to the present moment, you're actually increasing the probability of them showing up to the other programs. And you're increasing the probability of utility, and you're increasing the probability that you'll meet your goals, which is typically reducing retention, or improving employee retention, and profit and employee experience and engagement, and all these other very measurable outcomes. You get that by working on the environment, but especially by helping employees work on the inside of themselves first.
This is fascinating, and I think it's a real opportunity for us to make and bridge those gaps between work life and home life, because you're not leaving one or the other at the door.
That's
That
it.
just never happens. I mean,
Especially now post COVID, where half of us are working from home.
exactly. Yeah. So you
Literally,
don't get to isolate it.
you don't.
So to the company's benefit, encouraging that. First of all, I love that this is sort of in my mind taking shape as a process. You center yourself, you find this mindfulness space, you examine your emotions, you examine your reactions to things. And I like how you said you can go from unpleasant to neutral, where you honor the pause. That was honestly one of the main reasons I wanted to talk to you. When I saw this honor the pause, I was like, yes, we just
Mhm.
all have to be quiet for a minute and take a minute.
Please.
Like take a beat for heaven's sakes, take a
Yeah.
beat. But then you can move to action. And
Yes.
then that action can be, more connective because you're leaving the heavy after acknowledging and figuring out why. I spoke to a guy a while back named Eric Edmides, and he said, you create your own triggers. Why is this a trigger for you?
Hmm.
Like, figure that out, and then you can make a connection with somebody else.
Yeah.
So, the value of this work both personally and for corporate America, and basically, honestly, for all of our institutions.
Mhm.
It's just beyond measure. So I really want to thank you
Beyond
for
measure.
bringing this not only to light, but to putting it in such a way that we can see where across society, this kind of practice, this mindfulness, this meditation, this focus, I forget I have it written down here about the ways that you get to that space can really benefit all of us, not only individually, but as a society. So thank you, thank you, thank you for joining me today. Now, please tell everybody else where they can find out more about you.
Yes, I'm so happy to have this conversation with you today and your audience. And you can find me on my website, ShawntaHooks.com, SHAWNTA hooks.com. You can also follow me on social media, Shawnta Speaks. I'm very active on LinkedIn. And my goal is to really help people understand how they can make mindfulness practical at work. And, I'll leave your audience with a quick tip. When you're starting a meeting, especially if you notice that the person you're meeting with, and I'm talking about a workplace meeting, a Zoom meeting, and you notice that the person you're meeting with maybe is a little frazzled. Maybe they showed up a little late because they're going from meeting to meeting, or maybe you're frazzled. Maybe you're a little bit late. You can start the meeting with what I call a moment of arrival. And you don't have to use the words meditation. You don't have to use the words mindfulness. You don't have to be a practitioner. You just simply say, here's your script. Let's allow for a moment of arrival. I'm coming from another meeting. My mind is still there. It's not here. So let's just take 30 seconds and just sit in silence so that we can allow our mind to catch up with our body. And then you start your meeting after that. It could even be 10 seconds with that moment of arrival. And then you start your meeting and watch how much more effective the meeting is.
I absolutely love that idea. It's a quick tip. And I think that's another key here. These things, you don't have to sit in meditation for hours and hours.
Right.
Even taking that 30-second moment, sitting quietly, closing your eyes, it lowers your blood pressure. It does all of those wonderful things. And that's something we didn't even touch about. The fact that this can affect you physically in a very
Yeah.
positive way by taking those moments. And again, to your point about forging connections. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Everybody, please take a few moments. Check out Shawnta. She is obviously brilliant, as you have heard her. She's putting up a new website. It's fantastic. I've already had a sneak peek. It looks wonderful. Please check all of this out. And if you still need a little bit more brilliance and resilience to your day, head on over to brilliantlyresilient.net. Sign up for our Brilliance Bit. Shawnta will be a part of that when this episode airs. And we will see you next time on the Brilliantly Resilient podcast. Thanks for tuning in to the Brilliantly Resilient podcast. Join our Facebook group and follow us on YouTube to be inspired with tools to reset, rise, and reveal your brilliance.